writer and editor for Sifted, no less, and Financial Times. And also we have Arvind Tiwari, who is the Vice President of Digital Product and Data for a company called Atai Life Sciences. I'm really intrigued to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us. Really happy to be here. My name is Adam Green. I write for Sifted, science and technology reporter, and we recently did a deep dive report on psychedelics and mental health, both the development of business models and also the clinical research and state of the evidence. And it was a really interesting project for us, and we had the good fortune to come across Atai Life Sciences and the work that they're doing, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Arvind Tiwari. So we're going to be talking about Atai's journey, we're going to be talking about the state of the evidence with regards to psychedelics and mental health treatment, and also where digital therapeutics comes into this. So Arvind, thanks a lot for joining me.
Good morning. Thanks, Adam.
I'd like to start by just setting the scene of the mental health crisis, which we just heard about there, how it's gotten worse over the COVID period, and really the lack of breakthrough treatments that we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you everyone for making it up here to the end of the maze. I'm not sure if this is the reward at the end of the mouse maze, but it's something like that. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the unmet needs, I'll throw a couple of facts at you. It's startling, right? You have 1 billion people today globally that are affected with a psychiatric disorder. Innovation in the industry, CNS innovation in the industry has been far from adequate. Really, there's not really been a paradigm shift in the industry since the SSRIs in the 1980s. Spravato, which is a form of ketamine, which came out in 2019, really was the first big push in a very long time. So it's not surprising that what we have is totally inadequate in terms of treatments. So, if you look at things like remission rates, really 50% of people respond to SSRIs. If you look at relapse rates, right, so these are people who've got better and then are back on that trajectory, back into disease. I mean, you see relapse rates of 70% plus in disorders such as opioid use disorder, alcohol use disorder. It's pretty startling. So from our perspective, from Atai, from the sort of broader industry, we're positioning ourselves to deliver this paradigm change in terms of compounds and chemistry and sort of technology, which is close to my heart.
And in psychedelics specifically, what's the state of the evidence and what is it about these first psychedelic compounds that are coming through that have given you optimism that this is a serious pathway for treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it's pretty topical, I'm sure. I mean, let's sort of do an interactive piece. I've been told to do a bit of an interactive piece. So maybe hands up. Has anyone seen the recent BBC article on magic mushrooms and the sort of recent study that came out there? Great, I can talk about it. This is good. This is good stuff. So I think, sort of take a step back, right? These, the psychedelics have quite a big legacy attached to them. Clearly sort of clamped down after a huge amount of research in the 60s. But I sort of want to reiterate, these are some of the most used drugs by mankind, right? So there is a huge body of evidence that is hugely supportive and actually recently growing, very much growing, right? And so I think two of the big sort of programs that have come out recently, one is psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And so that is starting a big phase 3 study next year after some really great results in their phase 2. And the second one is the use of MDMA alongside psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD. So the plan there is that should be FDA approved next year, and that's going to be available in the market. I think what we're seeing with the psychedelics is sort of two things that are pretty unique. Firstly, they're rapid acting. So you're really seeing patients responding to these compounds pretty much the day of, if not the day after dosing, right? And if you're taking typical antidepressants, you're looking at like a 2-3 month sort of, lead-in phase before any of this stuff kicks in. the second piece is it's really making a difference, particularly for the cohorts that are very difficult to treat, right? And so, the so-called treatment refractory patient population, those are sort of individuals that have not responded to treatment as usual care. We're seeing these individuals who've sort of been with depression for 20, 30 years and severe depression going into remission, right? Sort of a week in, going into remission and staying there for sort of 3, 6, 12 months after a single dose, right? So again, from our perspective, it's a total game changer. I think the sort of question that we often get asked is, how does this stuff actually work? You sort of have this image and, a bunch of sort of Netflix programs of a whole sort of kaleidoscope and, people sort of journeying into their minds. I think we're still trying to work out what's actually going on, but it sort of revolves around two hypotheses. One is just a disruption of the neural networks in the brain, which essentially allows the individuals to sort of see a way out of stuff. And, the analogy that people sometimes use is when you have a plane sort of taking off and it's going through the turbulence in the cloud, and it all of a sudden sort of steadies and stills as you break over the cloud, right? So it gives individuals an ability to see a way out. The second piece, which is particularly applicable to the technology that we're developing, is it primes the brain to take on new cognitive and behavioral processes, right? I think the one thing I want to make clear is the treatment pathway right now is very much you have the compound and there is adjunctive psychotherapy, sort of both pre and post the dosing. So, there is what we call a neuroplasticity that's being created in the brain. And we can see it through all sorts of, weird and wacky experiments. But sort of the hypothesis there is it allows people to really take on psychotherapy much faster, much more deeply. And that's what we're trying to deliver through the technology.
I remember in the report, one of the interviewees that we spoke to talk about this problem of stuckness in mental health issues, that people are just stuck and they can't see a way out. And so you're really just opening the horizon for people to be open. And then you talked about psychotherapy, and I think this is an important thing to touch on, that it's both the compound and the psychotherapy, and that brings us into the digital therapeutics piece as well, in terms of you don't just put people in a room, give them the drug, and hope that they have an enlightenment moment, a conversion. You have to prepare them beforehand for what they're going to be experiencing. You have to guide them during the experience, and then you have to make sure that after the experience it's been integrated into some long-term change. So I thought maybe just talk us through, where does the psychotherapy piece fit in, and then how do you guys think of the role of digital therapeutics as a support, as an enabler for that process?
Yeah, totally. I think you've described it really well. I'm not going to ask you whether you've taken any psychedelics before, but you clearly know what you're talking about. It's exactly that, right? So for us, the psychotherapy, so when you go through a trip, when you go through a session, there is a volatility in response to the dose, right? Some people, can be fine. Some people, it can be pretty stressful. So what we have is an individual in the room, a facilitator who's always on hand just to sort of check in if anything sort of starts to go a little bit pear-shaped. What we try and do to essentially alleviate that up front is provide them with what we call set and setting therapy, right? Which is really getting the mindset right, giving them some psychoeducation, empowering them sort of over the process that they're about to go through. The second piece is then immediately post the dosing, when they are in this highly neuroplastic state. Again, the hypothesis is this is where you can really give them as much new cognitive and behavioral processes to take on board. So that's where we start to sort of gently load in some of the psychotherapy. And then the sort of third piece, as you say, is the long maintenance period, right? So for us, it's all about continuing to give them skills, allowing them to practice those skills, and really keeping them out of relapse, right? That's sort of the key piece there.
And in terms of digital specifically, what do you think that digital and data can do and add to this process? And especially, what can it do now with the state of the tech that we have compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, look, the biggest issue is there are never going to be enough therapists to deliver therapy, right? Again, one of the startling facts I always get from my sort of American colleagues is 50% of US counties don't have a psychiatrist, right? Which sort of is mind-boggling. And that's, don't forget, that sort of doesn't show you that it's all, the therapists are skewed to the sort of east and western seaboard anyway, right? So that number's actually worse for a much bigger part of the population. Fundamentally, digitizing psychotherapy allows you to sort of circumnavigate this big gap in supply demand, right, between the number of patients, the number of therapists that are required, and that gap's only getting bigger, right? It's important to say, we're not trying to replace the therapist, right? There's always going to be a role for face-to-face therapy. What we're trying to do is potentially replace the sort of low-value items, sort of low-resource items that sort of therapists get engaged in, and allow them to see more people, right? It's almost like a force amplifier. I think that being said, obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but I think there are some incredible things that technology can do in delivering psychotherapy to people that you can't get through face-to-face, right? First and foremost, the way we're developing psychotherapy at Atai is really creating what we call a sort of multidisciplinary team in your pocket, right? So it's really the clinical protocol that we're providing is sort of transcending, behavioral activation, CBT, acceptance committance therapy, DBT, right? So we basically have a whole bunch of schools of therapy in sort of one modality, which otherwise would not be able to be accessed by a single individual, right? Or certainly not to the sort of level of expertise that we're drawing in from all these various academics. I think the sort of second thing you can do with technology is you can make this stuff really engaging, right? I mean, one of the biggest issues in therapy is the churn rate, right? Particularly not just up front as you're trying to find the right therapist, you're trying to jive with them and sort of develop a relationship. But once you're actually in the process, life happens, right? And you either think, hey, look, I'm getting better, I don't need to do any of this stuff, right, I'm out. Or quite the opposite, this stuff sucks, right? I'm having to come in every week, I'm stuck in traffic, I see my therapist, I don't like them, I think they're judging me, forget this isn't for me, right? So I think one of the things you can do in technology is make this stuff really engaging, really interesting to use. And there's a whole bunch of different tools that we can do with that, right? So we can gamify things, we can change up the media in terms of animation, articles, movies. What we're trying to do at Atai is just give them these sort of small bite-sized chunks, particularly up front, just to get the sort of train moving, right? Build up some momentum, and then we can start giving them bigger and sort of larger pieces further down. And then I think the third thing that you can do that we're trying to do is actually really personalize the therapy to the individual, right? So as they're sort of interacting with the technology, there's a huge number of touch points that we have in terms of when are they using the therapy? Which particular schools are they most engaged with? Those are what we sort of call more active markers of interaction. We're also exploring passive markers of interaction, starting off with activity. Just literally looking at, what the intensity of activity that people are doing, the time of day that they're doing it at. All of that sort of feeds into, okay, let's try and personalize the therapy that we're giving them in the app exactly to how they're reacting to it in real time.
Let's talk a bit about adoption, because obviously the clinical evidence is very promising, but both sort of, the field of psychotherapy, psychiatry needs to be on board. Public attitudes are obviously very relevant. We've seen definitely a shift in public attitudes towards psychedelics over the last few years, even to the point of some being legalized and decriminalized in a number of countries. And then, of course, reimbursement and who's going to pay for it and how do you make the case for that. So what do you think are the most important communities to engage with when you're trying to take this from the clinical evidence to adoption so that it becomes something that people can actually access?
Yeah, definitely. I'll sort of talk about it from a technology perspective, given we're at a technology conference, but I'll sort of drop in some sort of psychedelic pieces in there as well. this is happening, right? Technology adoption is absolutely happening, right? And why do we think that's the case? Because it's that fundamental fact there are not enough people to treat the number of patients out there, right? So we're going to need some sort of way about sort of to go about it. We sort of talk about it, or at least I talk about it. I'm not sure if I've sort of convinced the team yet, but we sort of talk about it in terms of our customer is the clinician. Right, so it's we know this stuff works for patients, evidence-based psychotherapy that's being delivered, right? We know that stuff works. The question is, how do we convince the patients to sort of adopt it and deliver it, right? And I think there's sort of a couple of pieces there. One is just showing them the clinical evidence, right? Showing them they are used to seeing highly protocolized, well-controlled, big cohort studies that have come out of big pharma, a very detailed label that gives them, real comfort in what they're delivering, right? So I think there is a bit of a catch-up phase that the sort of health tech world is well on its way to doing, in really sort of demonstrating not just clinical results, but robust clinical results, right? So I think that's sort of the first piece. And the second piece is pretty interesting. I sort of hear this from a lot of people in the industry. It's just education, right? It's really, we're at a health conference, right? I'm guessing that puts us, in terms of interest in technology, that probably puts us in 5%, right? I'm not going to call it the top or the bottom, but it's sort of in a 5-10% bracket. We underestimate. I'm not going to say the savviness, but the sort of reception to technology that the broader population has, particularly a conservative industry like healthcare, right? So there's a real sort of education piece around what does this technology do? How does it integrate into your treatment pathway, particularly because you're a frazzled psychiatrist whose book is basically booked up twice over, right? And now all of a sudden, I'm having to give, a VR headset to someone and troubleshoot them because they lost a password, right? That's not going to work for me. So I think that's a piece there. And then more broadly, it's about getting a pathway to reimbursement, right? How do you get paid for this stuff as a sort of developer? Because that is the only way that we can drive funding from investors at the back end to really help us with the R&D piece.
Yeah, and I know, one of the gripes that we heard, we interviewed quite a few companies in this space for the psychedelics report, and they talked a bit about the media and how the media covers psychedelics. And I think the media has tended to cover this field as kind of a bit kooky and a little bit quirky and a bit out there. And I think one of the frustrations is actually it's hardcore science, it's proper science. And I think that public attitudes have softened, but also the media has a challenge of how do we report on this in a way that removes psychedelics from some of its kind of cultural connotations and the backdrop, and actually looks at it as something that, as you said, has been around for thousands of years, and there's good reasons for that. I wondered, is there anything that you think the industry is grappling with as it moves forward? What are maybe some of the big obstacles that you face kind of day to day that you think that you see in your peers as well that you're trying to overcome?
Yeah, actually, do you know what? I'm just going to turn that around on you slightly. If you haven't seen, so Adam did a fantastic sifted psychedelic article recently. I think it was like a month or two ago. If you haven't read it, you've got to read it, right? It's such an incredible primer. So, Adam, I'm going to turn that around on you first. What did you see as you were sort of doing your report as some of the key barriers that we need to get over?
Well, I think one of the challenges is around mental health still not being enough of a priority in health systems. So you know, in terms of funding, in terms of innovation, in terms of R&D, and that might be because it's intimidating, because our understanding of the brain is so far behind our understanding of many other areas of biology. So I think one challenge is sort of how do we make the whole mental health sector be taken more seriously for public spending and public investment and government engagement. A second thing was there is still some conservatism among governments in some parts of the world, in some regions, where they still have some historical baggage around psychedelics and maybe are still conservative, or small c conservative, and kind of scared of what this industry looks like. A few bad actors in the space. We've seen some issues where you need to train the psychotherapists. You need a whole community of professionals, and it's not clear that we have a workforce plan for that yet. And that's why the digital piece is so interesting, because I think in the US there have been some cases where the facilitation and the management of those sessions was not done in a way that was optimal. You have people who are vulnerable, who are in a very heightened vulnerable state when they're under psychedelics, so you need a workforce that really knows how to manage that and deal with that. So I think those were some of the things that came through in our discussions.
Yeah, the first point that you touched on is great. The sort of taking mental health seriously, and actually sort of one step further. Right? How do you integrate it into the healthcare system? Because particularly in the US, it's sort of physical health and behavioral health, right? And actually, we all know about the lack of interoperability in the sort of different areas, and then you're trying to sort of jive these two areas of medicine, which are completely integrated, right? I mean, we sort of think about some of the sort of precision psychiatry stuff that we're doing at Atai, and really trying to stop treating. Everyone sort of has this. You're depressed, right? That's the general label, and I'm just going to treat you the same way as I'm going to treat you is the way I'm going to treat you, right? And what we're trying to do is basically ingest a whole bunch of different signals, sort of biological and digital, to start stratifying these patient groups, right? Start creating within this sort of depression label a group of individuals that have shared characteristics. And actually, some of those signals, as I said, are physical, sort of physical signals and mental health signals, right? And so really, I think there is going to have to be an integration of sort of mental health and physical health infrastructure if we're really going to meet the sort of mental health crisis going forward, right? Someone said to me the other day, it's sort of not mental health, it's whole organism health, because it's totally interrelated.
Great. Well, we've just got a couple of minutes left, so that's been fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Arvind. Are there any questions? We've got time for one or two questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions for Arvind or indeed for myself. No, we have resolved everything.
It's a very comprehensive talk, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think FDA approval, very important. I think something that people don't labor enough on is FDA approval is a marketing authorization, right? It doesn't tell you that there is going to be adoption by clinicians of this stuff, right? And I think the great sort of example of that is a whole bunch of digital therapeutics from Pear and Akili. Both have FDA approval. Actually, if you look at their revenue numbers, pretty low, right? But anyway, you're absolutely right. That's sort of the first step, getting that sort of certification. What's key is very, very early engagement with the regulators. And really what we're hearing from them is the moment you've sort of gone through a phase 1B, right, to really start talking with them, to really get their input on the clinical trial design. Not just, because we're starting to get into the land of complex here, because we have a compound and we have psychotherapy. And one of the questions that's sort of, out there is, if you then have a single endpoint that's being measured across the two, how do you disaggregate what benefit was provided by the compound, what benefit was provided by the psychotherapy? And actually, the reason people ask that is, you sort of need sort of tagline from the FDA is, look, we're going to approve a label that is necessary and sufficient, right? So there is a potential world out there where, what we sort of call them factorial study designs, where you have to actually test each individual arm, which is a real pain in the ass. You don't want to go down there. Very expensive, complex. So anyway, that's why you sort of want to have a very early conversation with them. I think what's really heartening is seeing their reaction to, some maps and sort of the MDMA piece. Unfortunately did have, had some sort of bad news that came out of it. It's a massive learning lesson. Again, this is the first time that there is this is sort of compound adjunctive psychotherapy, right? This is the first time any of this stuff has ever been created, right? So I think what was heartening to see the positive FDA reaction there. Compass Pathways, whom we're sort of a strategic investor in, had their phase 3 study go past the FDA as well. So, yeah, look, you're absolutely right. That is the first step, but I think what's going to be even more important is showing results to the payers and to the clinicians to actually get that adoption. I wish I did. I wish I did. We're all looking for it.
Great. One more question if we have time. Thank you. Yeah, so for those who didn't hear, the first question was around sort of cost and the role of that in adoption. The second was about the patient journey. I know on the cost point from the conversations that we had, the cost of the status quo is so high, and I think that's what a lot of psychedelics companies are talking about, that SSRIs are not working very well, and I think the burden of mental health and the cost of that is how they're sort of contextualizing it. But Arvind, either of those points that you want to take on?
Yeah, no, look, it's spot on, right? This is fundamentally a very expensive treatment pathway, right? You have someone getting dosed, potentially requiring supervision for up to 12 hours, right? And then you're sort of letting them out loose. They're coming back in for a couple of sessions. It's not cheap. Fundamentally, it's going to come down to two levers. Can we bring that cost piece down? And that's where the technology piece plays. But also, and this is where I absolutely believe we're going to be, can we demonstrate that we save more than that, right? And so particularly when you start looking at the treatment refractory population, this is basically the 5% of the population that account for 70% of healthcare costs, right? So yes, it may be an expensive cost up front, but actually when you start looking at the cost savings over a 12, 36-month period, you'll absolutely, you'll sort of see the sort of balance there tip in favor. Very quickly on the sort of second piece, it's a great point, and actually got a colleague of mine who's very big on this. It actually weirdly cuts both ways, right? They're desperate. So, some of these patients have, as I said, been trying treatments for up to 40 years, right? I mean, it's pretty tough. Nothing's working for them, and they're now seeing results coming out that are benefiting this particular population. What we do need to be careful is, again, this isn't a one-size-fits-all model. This isn't going to work for absolutely everyone. And so being very cognizant of how do we look after the individuals who may be putting a significant amount of hope into this, but also the whole sort of population cohort as they leave the clinical trials to really continue to look after them once they're sort of out of the clinical trial model. So, we're engaged with patient advocacy groups to really make sure that we bring that patient-centric model not just into our treatment design. So by that I mean, the compound protocol and the technology, but also into the clinical trial piece as well, and really making sure they're at the heart of it. It's a great question. I wish more people sort of asked that piece.
Yeah, we definitely heard about the overhyping and people thinking they're just going to take the pill and it's done. And actually, there's a lot of hard work that needs to go in after that, and they need support. Arvind, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. Great to see you, and thank you everyone for attending. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you.